On September 29, 2006, in St. Patrick's Church in Glasgow, Great Britain, detectives discovered the body of a young girl. They had no idea that this crime was just the tip of the iceberg, and their investigation would lead them to one of the most ruthless serial killers in the country. Pierre Britton Tobin was born on August 27, 1940 in Johnston, Scotland, as the youngest of 8 children in the family of Marjorie and Neil Tobins. From a young age, Pierre showed a difficult character. Because of this, in 1953, at the age of 7, his parents sent him to a boarding school, but in vain, as he was later sent to a reform school. Although the reasons are unknown, after this period, he moved to Brighton, England. Around this time, Pierre began a relationship with Margaret Mott, a 17-year-old girl. The young girl, who worked as a typist, was blinded by his attractive personality, and in August 1969, they got married. But Pierre's cruel, controlling, and abusive nature quickly became apparent. As if that weren't enough, he was also involved in criminal activities, and a year later, he was convicted and imprisoned in England for theft and document forgery. After that, Margaret decided to divorce him in 1973. In 1973, Pierre remarried Sylvia Jeffries, a 30-year-old local nurse. She too was charmed by his irresistible allure. That same year, the couple had their first son, whom they named Stephen, and a year later they had a daughter, Claire. But unfortunately, she died shortly after birth due to Pierre's abuse. This is why in 1976, Sylvia left, taking their young son with her. Decades later, around the age of 40, Pierre was ready for a new romance. This time, his chosen one was Kathy Wilson, a 16-year-old girl. Kathy was vulnerable, innocent, and impressionable, making it easy for him to start a relationship with her. They first moved in together, and soon they had Daniel, their only child. They got married in 1989 and then moved to Scotland. It was a difficult time for Kathy, as her husband wouldn't let her go out and tried to control her every move. His violence also reached a considerable level, to the point that the young woman eventually found the courage to flee with their son in the late 1990s. It is unclear whether Kathy's departure was the cause of the man's worst traits coming to the surface, but it is evident that from that moment on, Pierre stepped into the world with the worst parts of himself, ready to do a lot of harm. Unfortunately, his path crossed with that of a pretty girl named Vicky Hamilton. Vicky was born in Scotland in 1976 and was the second child of the family of Michael and Janet Hamilton, a married couple who had already had a first daughter, Lynn. Later, Lindsay and Lindsay were born. However, serious disputes arose between the spouses, and divorce seemed like the best solution. Vicky, Lindsay, and Lindsay remained in their mother's care, with whom they had to move to South London, while the eldest daughter stayed in Bathgate, maintaining close ties. When Vicky was 15, Sharon thought it was a good opportunity for her sister to take a step toward independence, as many teenagers desire. After the 15-year-old girl spent a weekend in Scotland, she was supposed to return to her mother's place. It was the first trip she was making alone by bus. Sharon saw it as a small but significant adventure. On Saturday, February 9th, 1996. Sunday was no different from any other day, except that Vicky was very nervous about the trip. The evening of February 10th was cold and snowy. Vicky checked that she had enough money to pay for the trip and reviewed the bus itinerary with her sister one last time. Then they hugged warmly. The young girl waited at the bus stop, munching chips in front of the police station. And it was there, while she was waiting for transport, that her path crossed with Pierre's. He forcibly drew her in. He forcibly lured her into his car, raped her, and then, either to prevent her from reporting him or out of sheer cruelty, killed her. He kept her purse. When Vicky failed to arrive at her mother's house and there was no news of her, her desperate family set out to find her and alerted the authorities to her disappearance. As soon as the police began investigating her disappearance, Vicky's face became one of the most recognizable in Scotland, and the search operations were among the largest in the country's history. While the case was causing a sensation in Scotland, Pierre decided to move to the southeast of England, in particular Margate, where he settled in a beautiful house with a garden, taking Vicky's lifeless body with him. There, Pierre wrapped her remains in sacks and hid them under a thick layer of concrete before covering the whole thing with a tarpaulin. The neighbors thought he was digging a sandbox for his little boy, who was 3 years old in 1991. He had come to Margate to spend some time with his father. The man's name never appeared in the initial investigation into Vicky's disappearance. Since the police found no clues about her whereabouts, they considered her a probable runaway. They believed she was an unhappy teenager due to her parents' divorce. Their theory of a voluntary disappearance was reinforced on February 21st, 1996, when Vicky's wallet was found near the main bus station in Edinburgh. Pierre, always one step ahead of the authorities, had created this false lead and succeeded in completely diverting the investigation. Detectives wasted 2 fruitless months searching for her in London. It is known that Vicky's mother passed away shortly thereafter. In the following years, the family and townspeople continued to follow the case. The police logged more than 7,000 names in the case file, collected nearly 4,000 testimonies, and produced around 500 documents and 380 potential pieces of evidence. But all this led nowhere, and the case was eventually closed. The next girl to have the misfortune of crossing paths with Pierre was from Essex. She had a brother and 3 sisters. Her father was a jazz musician, and her mother had died years earlier in a car accident. At 18, Dina was a good person, a happy girl, and an excellent friend. She had just finished high school and had high hopes for her future. On the one hand, she wanted to take a year off, perhaps to travel. And on the other, she wanted to go to university, but for the moment, nothing had been decided, because although she had applied, she hadn't received a reply from any higher education establishment. On the first weekend of August 1991, the young girl went to a music festival in Hampshire, where she met young David Tremblant. Between dances, they discovered that they liked each other. On the night of Sunday, August 4th, they slept together in a tent. The next day, Dina helped him dismantle the tent, and they agreed that each would hitchhike home. But as part of their journey was the same, they hitchhiked together. Tired but happy, the 2 young people went out onto the road to hitchhike. Then Pierre arrived and offered them a lift. David got out first, and Dina took down his phone number before saying goodbye. Alone with the stranger at the wheel, the young girl was about to go through hell. On that same Monday, August 5th, 1991, he acted the same way as he did with Vicky. One of Dina's handkerchiefs served as a gag. After his crime, Pierre withdrew money from the girl's account at ATMs in Glasgow and Sussex. When her loved ones saw that someone was withdrawing money from Dina's account, they immediately thought something had happened to her. Her family knew how carefully she saved every penny, and that she planned to use that money either for traveling or for continuing her studies. Days and weeks passed, and the worst part for the family was living in uncertainty. And even though no one said it out loud, they were all convinced that something horrible had happened. Because if Dina were alive, she would have already returned or called to explain the reasons for her absence. As for Pierre, he left Margate without saying goodbye or giving any explanation. Later, in 1993, he settled in Hampshire, specifically in a rented apartment in Leek Park, claiming he wanted to be closer to his young son. On August 4th, 1993, two 14-year-old teenagers went to visit a local resident, but the person they were looking for wasn't home. They then decided to ask the other neighbors if they had seen her. This led them to knock on Pierre's door. The man saw this as a unique opportunity. He invited them into his home to wait for the person they were looking for. Seeing that there was a 5-year-old boy in the apartment, the girls mistook him for someone benevolent and agreed to enter. But there's another version of how this encounter came about, and it wasn't by chance. Two young girls came to Pierre's house in response to an advertisement he had placed for a babysitter. They trusted him because when they arrived, it was asleep. Pierre tied them up, threatened them with a knife, and forced them to drink alcohol. Then he beat and raped them, seriously injuring one of them, just when they thought their lives were about to end at the hands of this extremely cruel man. Fortunately, the boy woke up and saved them from the same fate as Vicky and Dina. Seeking to prevent his son from understanding what had happened and what a father he was, the man decided to leave the apartment with the child. According to reports, Pierre left at around 2 a.m., but before doing so, he turned on the gas in the kitchen, hoping to carry out his dreadful plan. However, the girls regained consciousness and managed to escape. They went to the police and recounted all the abuse they had suffered at the hands of the individual, which they described in detail. At the same time, Pierre returned the child to his mother, and under a false identity, joined a religious sect called the Communion of Jesus, hoping to go unnoticed there. Meanwhile, the media broadcast his police-supplied photo, making his face highly recognizable. As a result of this widespread media coverage, information about the man began to pour in, and his vehicle was identified. Thanks to BBC Crime Watch, he was located and arrested in Brighton after 40 days on the run. He appeared in court on May 18, 1994, where he pleaded guilty to sexual assault and outrageous acts towards two young girls, and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. But Pierre didn't serve his full sentence, as he was released in 2004 at the age of 58. As soon as he was released, he returned to Scotland, seeking to get away from the places where his name had been placed on the sex offenders register. For a while, his trail was lost, until in 2006, under the guise of a homeless man named Pete McLaughlin, alias. Dennis and Kathy Curran, a couple from the church's charity group, will never forget the evening the homeless man came to seek asylum, despite his harmless appearance. Kathy had a bad feeling about this man. Pierre had been brought up Catholic and quickly felt at home in this church. What's more, his obvious begging was an excellent cover, since he elicited nothing but compassion from the parishioners, and few people paid him any attention. This meant he could roam freely around the place of worship, which was an ideal shelter for him. However, his predatory nature was still intact, and being in a sacred place meant nothing to him. Calculating in his every move, Pierre showed himself ready to participate in the renovation work the church needed. So about 6 or 7 weeks later, he asked the priest to hire him as a member of the maintenance staff. In those days, people in need or financial difficulty generally sought refuge in churches. This is how Angelika Kluk met Pierre. Angelika was a 20-year-old Polish woman who had arrived in Scotland in the summer of 2006. She wanted to take advantage of her vacation to work, earn some money, and finance her language studies back home. At the time, she was staying in the rectory of St. Patrick's, where she also worked as a cleaner. Angelika appealed to Pierre somehow, but he managed to persuade her to help him with various tasks from time to time. On Sunday, September 24, 2006, Angelika spent several hours helping him paint a shed. Some parishioners saw them together, and at one point Pierre assaulted her in the back of the chapel, Lika Brown, 47, and her husband, Andrew. Fortium heard a woman scream through the open windows of their building overlooking the church. In later depositions, Lika described the sound as a short scream and said it seemed to come from someone being forcibly restrained. It was so terrifying that it made her get up from the sofa and go to the window, but she saw nothing. The scream heard by the Browns was linked to the moment when Pierre caught the girl with her back to him. He hit her hard and dragged her to the back of the chapel, where he continued to beat her. After she lost consciousness, he raped her, then stabbed her several times. Pierre hid the body in a cellar under the floor next to the confessional. By this time, if Angelika had been alive, the parishioners would have noticed her absence. It was then that Dennis informed his wife, Kathy, of the strange disappearance. The police immediately launched an investigation, questioning members of the congregation, and during these interrogations, it became apparent that the last person seen with Angelika was Pierre, although he was posing as Pete, the homeless maintenance worker. He thus became the main suspect, and the officers went to question him, but found no evidence. The investigation continued. Pierre knew that finding the body and linking it to him was only a matter of time, so he fled to London. Meanwhile, investigator David Swinton had been brought into the investigation and concluded that this was probably not just a simple disappearance. Based on the evidence his team had uncovered and the testimonies collected, which led him to believe that Angelika would most likely not be found alive. Finally, on September 29, 2006, authorities discovered the body in the chapel, a revelation that shocked the British public, particularly due to the location chosen by the criminal to conceal the body matched the data in the National Criminal Intelligence database. They then learned that the man they were searching for was Pierre Tobin. His fingerprints were also found at the crime scene. The first step taken by the authorities was to publish his photo in the media. His image was also sent to the search and tracing team. Police Scotland coordinated with the Metropolitan Police, and searches were launched across the UK, particularly in London. He tried to hide in a place where he thought he could find refuge. He presented himself at the hospital, claiming to have heart problems, and pretended to feel chest pains and weakness on his left side. The man said he was a plumber. He gave his name, James Kelly. He was examined by Dernick Losso, who conducted some tests. However, something about the man's face and behavior made the doctor uneasy from the start. The man was hesitant to make eye contact, which is unusual for a patient. The tests did not reveal any cause for the pain he claimed to feel, leading the doctor to suspect that something was wrong. His suspicions were confirmed by a nurse who recognized Peter from his photo. As a result, she and the doctor contacted the police. A phone call changed the entire dynamic of the investigation. On September 30th, Officer Alan Muir was sent to a hospital in London. Peter was taken to a ward and Alan went there to speak with him. The man was immediately arrested. Although he was initially only charged with violating the conditions of the sex offender registry, he was swiftly taken into custody. This strategy allowed the officers to prepare a case against him. Evidence gathered by a police team, led by Inspector David, led to Peter's trial for the offense. At the end of March 2007, Peter was tried for the crime against Angelica. Despite all the evidence against him, the man denied committing any violent acts against the young woman. However, to clear himself of the rape charge, he claimed that they had a consensual, intimate relationship. Peter also denied providing false information to the police and hospital staff. After a 6-week trial, his manipulations proved unsuccessful as he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 21 years. One might think that the authorities would be satisfied with this outcome, but Inspector David and his team were convinced that Peter's story did not end there. Persons cases with the locations where Peter had been. During this investigation, the detectives were able to establish 2 precise connections, one in Bathgate and the other in Margate. A few weeks later, Peter's former house on the coast was searched, and a knife containing DNA samples was found hidden in the attic. But there was nothing else. They then went to the house where the man had lived in Margate, garden of the house that the man had built for his son. They found the body of a woman there. They continued their search in the same spot and found another body. In the same place, they also found a woman's handbag, which the team kept for DNA analysis, while the forensic police tried to establish the identity of the 2 victims in order to determine their age and possible time of death. They were also analyzing a bag found at the crime scene. The bag found at the crime scene was analyzed, but there was no match in the national DNA database. However, on June 1st, 2007, the DNA matched Peter's fingerprint. This was a decisive breakthrough, and the officers felt it was necessary to pursue this lead. On November 14th, 2007, authorities confirmed that one of the bodies belonged to Vicky Hamilton, who had disappeared at the age of 15 during her first solo trip. Her family had been waiting for an answer for 16 years. It was later announced that the second body found belonged to Dina McNichol, 18, who was hitchhiking home after attending a concert in 2008. The Crown Prosecution Service contacted Peter's lawyers, accusing him of Vicky's murder, which led to his being taken to the hospital. Officers had to restrain Vicky's father, Michael, after he saw Peter face to face, as he admitted at the time that he just wanted to let this man know that he was there to defend his daughter's name and protect her memory. After a month-long trial, on December 2nd, 2008, Peter was found guilty of Vicky's murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Dina's trial took place in December 2009, and on December 16th, after the defense presented no evidence to exonerate their client. Write your opinions in the comments and subscribe to my YouTube channel.